Hey there, buddy. Why don't you take a seat? Bethesda, we need to talk. I want you to know that we're all here because we care about you and want to help. Things have been rough for a little while, and all we want is for you to get better. We're here today to talk to you, to show we care, but also to show you how you can help yourself to get back to where you once were. First off, let's get the unpleasant reality out of the way. Your last two big games were not well received. Both Fallout 76 and Starfield ended up getting some very strong criticisms from players. When it was just 76, that was fair enough. A one-off blip where you tried to do a multiplayer game but things went wrong and the end product was busted and broken. We all could have got over that just fine. But when you then brought out a new single-player game, and the problem this time wasn't bugs or crashes, but instead the intentional design of the game itself, well, that's when it was certain that things weren't going right for you. There's been a bit of a general downward trend in many regards since your heyday, and we need to address it. In the past, you made games which sparked the imagination of millions, which helped to push boundaries, and even change the way fans viewed their favourite franchises. But now it feels like you're in a bit of a rut. Even though we're getting games from a trio of different genres, they all feel like they're trying to copy one another, and they tend to be doing a worse job with each new iteration. While having a similar feeling makes sense, given that the engine is either the same or essentially just an updated version, but that doesn't mean we need to be seeing the same thing over and over again. Let me give you an example. Shouts were a really cool part of Skyrim. They gave fun gameplay powers while being integrated in with the lore for it being a part of a dragon language. You played as the Dragonborn, and due to that you could use the same abilities as dragons themselves, so things like breathing fire with the Yol shout made total sense while still being badass. And then when Starfield came out, you threw a bunch of these same powers in again, but without seeming to understand the concept of why they worked the first time around. In a high fantasy world where everyone is casting spells, battling monsters, and doing other wild activities, it fits in perfectly to have the player character have access to a bunch of crazy powers. But when you are developing a more grounded and reality-based sci-fi game, it just doesn't quite fit in with the vibe in the same way. I'm not saying you couldn't have included these powers in some way, but tying them to the relics didn't make much sense from a lore perspective. The relics are all about dimensional travel, a strong sci-fi concept, but then you throw in these powers as a side thing with no strong link to that theme. If you wanted to have some sort of gravity blast, why wasn't that incorporated into a weapon? An upgraded version of the modern day air cannon, possibly in the hands of city-based law enforcement as a non-lethal way to deal with threats. And the Sense Star Stuff power, the one that lets you see enemies through walls and such. It's not like we don't already have handheld motion scanners as a staple of sci-fi. The Alien movies made this such an iconic bit of science fiction technology that it's crazy it wasn't incorporated this way. Look, I'm not saying you have to throw out all of the cool stuff you worked on in previous games, but it's important to make it actually fit in a way which really makes sense, rather than just shoehorning it in without much thought. If you just spent a bit more time on figuring out how to make these systems fit in better with the world, then we'd all be having a great time. We all know that you're capable of iterating upon your past elements, and that you can do it well. Just take a look at Fallout's junk system. Back in Fallout 3, it was super clunky, with these weird recipes that you had to both remember and find ultra-specific items to make what you needed. But with Fallout 4, you completely overhauled that idea with the junk system, which was genius. Now all the random items you're finding in the wasteland have a purpose. Looting has become so much more rewarding, and it fits in perfectly with the idea of surviving in the post-apocalypse. Most wastelanders have to scavenge and rummage around the place in order to make what they need to survive this harsh new world, and the whole junk system made that work in terms of both lore and gameplay. And then, when it came to Fallout 76, you actually managed to improve the system a little bit. You kept the improvements fairly reined in, just focusing on little quality of life stuff, like being able to scrap junk items to their base components at workbenches in order to free up a little carry capacity. It wasn't a huge change to the system, but it worked. You had something good, so rather than shift it entirely, you made the smart call to just refine it a little. You were doing so good with this idea, Bethesda. And then along came Starfield, and despite this being a different vibe entirely, you clearly still wanted to stick with the junk system you had worked so hard on. But it makes no sense to try and make that same sort of junk system applicable when the setting in no way justifies it. Seriously, I'll take this one real quick, Sarge.
Hey, bud. Hey, Bethesda. How you doing, pal? It's me, Kato. We've known each other for a little over 20 years, actually. Ow, my mortality. And know that Sarge and I wouldn't sit you down like this if we weren't fans of what you create. But we also know that they can be better. They can get better. So when we witnessed some pretty cool mechanics in Fallout 4 and had them then taken away in Starfield, well, let me explain. Junk and clutter items are kind of the most useless they've ever been since maybe like Oblivion. And Fallout 4 was a great step in the right direction at putting use in essentially everything that you could pick up and loot. The scrapping and junk system was actually pretty great. And while I understand the want to kind of make Starfield its own thing, this is one of many regressions, I feel, were made for the sake of just being different, but not making the experience better in any way. A lot of artists spent time making all of these various like decoration objects. The amount of succulents in the game is silly. I know some people do collect succulents in Starfield, but wouldn't it be great if you could do other stuff with them? What I mainly want to talk about is how the organic and inorganic harvesting ultimately ended up making everything more complicated where it didn't really need to be. And there are features just seemingly missing that would make it more useful and user-friendly, like a bestiary, or the surveys that you take, being able to, access those surveys without them just being a static item that you sell for credits. And I would argue that you can still make something its own thing while also retaining the systems that made this kind of thing at least somewhat user-friendly. So, as an example, if you break down a desk fan in Fallout 4, you will get the base components from that fan, including screws, which a lot of people would find valuable in making guns, or modifying guns in Fallout 4. Instead of something like Fallout 4's particular system for recycling or repurposing items, we only get to use raw materials and manufactured components that we have found or manufactured ourselves. Junk and clutter items are now relegated to being useless in a practical sense. All of these can still be used for decoration, but there is no possible way to make use of them for crafting. Having a system where everything is useful, taking it away, then complicating the process of crafting is a bit much. At least that's how I feel. Add on the need to do research, which costs more resources instead of just having a crafting skill at a certain rank, adds that many more extra steps to something that should be straightforward. I do understand what they were going for here. A survival type mechanic where you could survey worlds and their natural resources by wandering around and scanning, or physically gathering samples. Which is to say, that is cool on paper. Unfortunately, throwing a whole periodic table at your players and then expecting them to know what the application of these elements are, coupled with not even having a planet encyclopedia or the surveys we take to even be readable to find these elements quickly, causes a lot of players, myself included, to just head to a general store or mining shop in the main cities and just buy the raw materials instead. If your outposts and mining and gathering systems are too tedious for players to want to use them and you need to have mining shops to fill in the gap, then it might be worth looking into a recycling system so we can get the materials we need out of the stuff that we already have. My suggestion for this is actually inspired by Prey 2017, which had a lovely, simple, elegant recycling system. Simply put, any items affected by physics in Prey could be recycled, enemies and NPCs included. You could either load these items into one of the recyclers dotted around the station, or use a recycler charge on a pile of objects or enemies or accidentally yourself, and it would spit out raw resources that you could craft with. It doesn't have to be as simple as the 4 basic components that Prey had, but just having a way to recycle objects, or at the very least, equipment to grant you raw materials, would save us all the headache of handwriting a list of groceries, then trying to remember the planet we saw that had mercury and europium.
Thank you, Kato. I think we've let you know our concerns on that front. Let's talk about your fundamentals for a little bit. When working on yourself, it's always good to start from the core elements. Now, at the very core, you make RPGs, role-playing games. And there are certain elements which need to be a main focus when you're building an RPG. First up, the characters. You've made some great and memorable characters in your past games. People love Forks and Parthenax, and people absolutely detest Delphine. Both of these reactions are good signs when it comes to the writing side of things. You've written some truly iconic characters in the past, and there's nothing to say you can't do that again. Hell, I'd say your recent characters aren't necessarily bad. Samco is a space cowboy, and that is inherently a pretty cool concept. But a character is only as good as the world they're placed into. Even a relatively boring NPC can shine if the world is interesting enough. With Fallout, you were handed a really interesting mythos to work with, but with the Elder Scrolls, you built an epic fantasy universe from the ground up. You have different pantheons of gods, various regions we've been able to explore, and a variety of races that both build upon fantasy staples and bring something new into the mix. You have proven that you can build incredible and wondrous worlds. That's what you should stick to. Starfield sadly lacked this kind of interesting flavour to it. You instead tried to take the real world and predict a linear sort of future for humanity. The most interesting events all happened in the history of the settled systems, and the time you decided to place the player in is one in which very little of import seems to be occurring. The events of Morrowind take place in the final years of the Tribunal, and Fallout 4 occurs while 4 different factions are fighting to control the Commonwealth. But in Starfield, there's no real conclusions, and nothing I can think of which would really make the history books. You need to be setting your games in a time that is not only intended to be interesting for the in-world player character, but one that matters for the everyday people of that world. Create an epic framework to build around, and the game will immediately be more fun to play through. And you know, if you need some fresh blood in the writing room to come up with charismatic characters and world-changing events, I am available. Just saying. It's not just writing which needs a bit of an overhaul though. You also need to refocus on making every playstyle viable. In recent years, you've really been neglecting a couple of the different playstyles. On a personal note, I don't like the way that sniper rifles are trending. Damage drop-off seems to be becoming a really big thing within your games, but it's treated somewhat flatly across all weapons, meaning every weapon does significantly more damage the closer you are to the target. This works fine with shotguns and pistols, but when I'm holding a sniper rifle, I want it to be most useful at long range. Why do you keep trying to make me use the scope weapons at close range? It's supposed to be a long range weapon, so keep the damage numbers up at long range, or else this playstyle will go the way of unarmed. Yeah, that's right, we're talking about unarmed. In previous Elder Scrolls and Fallout games, this was a dedicated skill with super cool unarmed weapons to complement it. But for a while now, you've just been disregarding this entire way for people to play your games. I thought it was a bit odd when Fallout 4 had such a limited selection for unarmed weapons at launch, but then the DLC started being released and I figured you'd patch the problem that way. But no, you didn't. Sure, we got the meat hook in Far Harbor, but that was literally it. We've ended up with only 5 different unarmed options in total, while standard melee has over quadruple that amount. And by the time we reach Starfield, not only is unarmed completely useless, despite having a cool perk based around it, but you've also started to make it so that melee isn't particularly effective either. One of the great things about RPGs is letting the players play the game how they want to. But this only works if every playstyle is viable. You need to make sure that there are perks which greatly benefit all the possible ways someone will want to play your game, and weapons to go along with each build archetype. And while on the subject of different weapons, there's something else I want to talk to you about. But, you know, before I go into that, I want to reinforce that I'm not your only friend here who's worried about you. Eddie's been patiently waiting to say his piece and let you know his thoughts, on both where you've been going wrong as of late and how you can start getting back on the right path again. Eddie, please, go ahead. Thank you, Eddie. I think we can all echo that sentiment. Now, if we're talking about where things have gone downhill over time, I think the perfect case study is the legendary system. In the past, we had basic equipment and then unique variants of them. Every unique item would have a specific way to get it, often adding a fair bit of story to the item itself. This means you not only end up with a better version of gear that you've already been using, but there's some type of lore to go along with it too. This is a great system that I will back at every turn. But then you decided you wanted to try something a little bit different, and that's great! Except when it's not. In Skyrim, you put more emphasis on enchanted items, and this wasn't all bad by any means. Being tied into the crafting system meant that it wasn't just a case of finding a random enchanted item in a chest, but you could also craft these sorts of items yourself. Sounds good so far, but the problem was this system did encroach a little on uniques. We still had a bunch of great unique items in Skyrim, but a fair amount of the time we did just end up with a named enchanted item, which could just be made by the player character themselves, which does make them feel a little less special. But what made them feel even less special was Fallout 4. This was the point where the legendary system really came front and centre. While the game did still feature the odd true unique, they were few and far between. Instead, the focus was on randomly making enemies into legendary variants who would drop a completely random weapon or armor piece which had a random effect on it. Total RNG chaos, which robs the items of any structured story and prevents players from being able to tailor equipment for their builds. Sure, maybe your big guns character will stumble across a two-shot minigun, but it's just as likely that they'll get a troubleshooter's metal right arm, which is completely useless for your power armor-centered character. I'm sure that plenty of people do enjoy this system, but in the same way that people enjoy playing slot machines. There's no skill or fun from the actual process, folks are just hoping they can get lucky. Rather than try and correct course after this game, with your next two you just went harder on the RNG. When 76 came out, I didn't like how pervasive the legendary system now was, but I understood why you'd lean into it a little, what with it being a bit of an MMO. And the team has tried to make things better by bringing back some form of legendary crafting, feeling like a bit of a course correct back to the way Skyrim tried to do things. But then Starfield just ruins everything. Unique means one of a kind. Yet the game itself misdefines the word unique in order to pretend the legendary system gives you unique items. It doesn't, it just gives random crap to the player. And because we're now working on a multi-star legendary system, the number of potential items that can drop is in the hundreds of thousands. If you want a very specific item, then you have an infinitesimal chance to get it, like 0.00001% sort of odds. You may think I'm joking, but I ran the numbers back when I covered 76 full time, and the same problem was happening then. What this does is ensure that 1-star and 2-star items are just objectively worse than they can be. The small handful of uniques that were made ended up being inferior to what random items you could stumble across from a generic enemy or in basic containers. It's all just random shit happening with no purpose or vision to it. There's no artistry or skill shown here, just random shit thrown at the player in a sparkling light sort of effect. Hope that people are distracted by the pretty lights for long enough that they don't notice you've done nothing worthwhile with the system. Stop doing this, Bethesda. Seriously, the legendary system is so indicative of where you've been going wrong lately. Rather than take the time to try and craft something yourself, you just seem to be hoping that players will take all the random combinations that you've put into the game's computer and it will churn out something good enough to keep people happy. That doesn't work. It's lazy, it's garbage, and it needs to stop. Look, I'm sorry. I got a little bit heated with you there at the end, but I want you to know that you can still come back from all of this. Sure, you've lost a lot of the respect and admiration you spent so many years building up, but you can gain it back. Take your time to focus on making sure that your RPGs are actual role-playing games, ones that can resonate with fans and give them a memorable story with iconic characters. And when I say take your time, I really do mean that. We've got Avowed launching next week, which is a fantasy RPG made by Obsidian. I'm sure that it will really scratch the itch for a lot of Elder Scrolls fans and help tide us over until ES6 comes out. And then a month after that we've got Atomfall releasing, a post-apocalyptic game which goes down the alternate history angle. I know there will be plenty of Fallout fans who have their eye on this game too, as it looks like a great game for anyone who's into modern Fallout titles. We have other developers who can give good games to the fans of your franchises, Bethesda, so let them keep the anticipation at bay while you take your time to craft something truly worthwhile. Make sure that the next game you put out is a true RPG, one that not only keeps players entertained in the moment, but which can also stand the test of time and become an iconic piece of gaming history. You've done it before, and I believe you can do it again.